I'm renting a room in my house to a person who left for COVID-19 treatment 7 days ago. I'm 60 years old and I don't want to die from exposure to this person. Can I ban them from my house from coming back? So no statement as to whether or not it's a mother or not.
It depends on the state, like we've been saying. It depends on if you have a lease. But even if you don't have a lease, if you've been accepting money from them and they're in possession, they have rights. They have rights as a tenant, whether they have a lease or not. In New York State, especially, if you lock that person out, the courts are open for that, and they have a right to be there. It's a really unfortunate situation to be in, and that's why everyone's having to quarantine and self-isolate, because they have a right to that space as well, and that's their home. And if they're not there, they're probably going to have to be with somebody else or homeless. So I would do your best to stay away from common areas, or at least maybe I would speak to the tenant and I would designate some areas. And maybe it would behoove you to hire someone to come in and clean the place every so often.
Can a rent strike affect your credit history? Can a rent strike affect your ability to rent in the future? Should you only participate in a rent strike with an escrow account where you escrow the rent?
To be honest, I'm a tenant-friendly person, but I think the rent strike makes absolutely no sense. And you're going to owe the money. You're only causing more economic harm to your community. You're causing economic harm to your landlord. Maybe they were a good landlord. You're gonna owe the money unless Governor Cuomo or the legislature decides otherwise. So if you have the money, pay the rent. If you think you're gonna, kind of ride the coattails of other people's misfortune, probably not the best thing to do. If other people can't pay, they can't pay. Don't try to jump on the bandwagon. It would be my advice. Pay the rent.
Similar to Neil's advice, if you can pay your child support, pay your child support.
Yeah, I mean, we go
rely on the fact that the courts are closed to not pay your child support. Pay it.
Right. A rent strike is a protest, nothing more.
Can my landlord evict me if I fall behind on my rent during COVID-19? Can he charge me late fees, and can he lock me out?
So several things, as Jennifer specifically said. It depends. Excuse me, I think that was Patricia. The answer always depends. Your lease is what's going to be controlling here. Remember, it is a contract, just like anything else. Late fees, if they're contained in there, it depends what jurisdiction you're in. Right now, New York City is banned late fees until August 20th. They've also put a moratorium on evictions for non-payment, but really of any kind, because they're not accepting new filings. So the answer to that, in short, is no, but it also depends on where you are. What was this last part? Can he lock you out? No. Illegal lockouts are actually one of the few things that housing courts are open for if they're not closed. So if you do come home and your landlord has locked you out, first call 311. Tell them the situation, and then I would, in the morning, call the court, wherever you are, a county, and tell them the situation and ask them what you think you should do. Because generally, there'd be an emergency style motion where you can get on the calendar quicker, maybe even that day, where the landlord will have to appear if you can show that you served them, and have to answer to it. They also, depending on jurisdiction, may just send a marshal and a sheriff to let you back in. If you call 311 in New York City right now and you say someone locked me out, it's likely that the sheriff or a marshal, whoever is the governing body in the county that does municipal stuff, lockouts, anything that involves property residential wise, they might just come and let you back in. So I would first look at your lease for those questions. Again, maybe consult with an attorney if it gets dire enough, or if you're worried, or if the landlord locks you out, I would call the county court or the city court, wherever you're located, in the morning.
Great. Thank you, Michael. You've answered multiple people's questions there, so we really appreciate it. How much time does my landlord have to present me with a written notice before raising my rent? I want to know if I receive a rent increase during this time, can I contest it?
It depends if your apartment is market rate or stabilized or any other type of protection like New York has. If it is, then they can only raise it a certain amount and they have to give it to you in a certain form. And it's got to be between, I think it's 90 and 180 days. So 3 to 6 months. Once you get that notice and once they can prove that you had gotten that notice, if you don't sign the lease and you decide to hold over and stay, you're going to owe whatever the notice was, as long as it was a proper calculation, whatever the notice said. If it's a market rate apartment, it's free for all. It's whatever you can negotiate with them. If they didn't give you much notice or they didn't give you enough, you think, you can absolutely just continue paying the old amount and stay in the apartment, knowing that down the road they may take you into court for the difference in small claims. But those notices are very, very tightly watched in New York City. So if there's any problem with it or any delay and it wasn't in the window, it's no good. It really depends on when you got it. And it really depends on what kind of apartment you have and what city or state. I think you said it was New York.
They don't say.
Okay, well then that's my answer stands.
If it was in New York, there's lots of protection, and regardless of where the writer is from, there's probably statutory requirements in place as to what the notice has to comply with. So it's worth consulting with an attorney.
I used to practice foreclosures. I know Bowen knows this. The timeline of events is very, very important in notices.
I gave 2 notices to my management company that I would not be renewing my lease and that April 30th would be my last day. I asked them to send someone out with a mask to do a walkthrough to make sure I could get my deposit returned. They told me that because of the coronavirus, they would not be doing a walkthrough. What do I do to make sure I get my deposit back?
Get that in writing.
Get that they're not sending someone out to
get that in writing. Yeah, get that in writing. And then it's on them and you walk away. And, they'll have a certain amount of time where they have to return it. And they basically just gave up their right to walk through and inspect it. They waived it.
I am a tenant and I work from home in my apartment. I've had issues with my apartment, mold, and extreme noise from my upstairs neighbors during the day. And they told me verbally that I could pay less rent while they fixed the situation. I had to re-raise the issue, and now my landlord is threatening to take me to court for the back rent and has told me they want me to move out in 2 weeks. What can I do? Can they sue me for money after verbally telling me that I would get a rent break?
Well, one thing that's good about this is, people don't just start suddenly paying less rent, and landlords just don't start suddenly accepting less rent. So even if it was verbally, if you have a payment history where it shows you had a lease that was a term, and then in the middle of that term, the monthly amount changed and it happened several times, that's a good indicator that something happened. I don't have to, it's like the circumstantial evidence thing. I don't have to walk outside and feel the rain if I can, look at the ground and see it's wet. They're going to put 2 and 2 together. So if you can't get it in writing, or if you can't coax them to admit to it in a text message, I'd show up with some payment histories, and it's not going to add up to a judge.
I gave notice to my landlord in Brooklyn before April 1st that I could no longer afford to keep the apartment, and they put the apartment on the market. Is it safe legally for me to stop paying rent for May and beyond? Am I automatically released from my lease once the landlord signs a new lease?
Yes. Once somebody signs a new lease and moves in, they've mitigated their damages and you don't owe the money. They can't double dip. However, if your lease has some type of breakage clause in there, a court will enforce that. If you've negotiated in your lease that if you vacate early, you owe them $400, regardless, it's in the contract. It's what's called liquidated damages. You've already negotiated this. You decided how much it's going to cost, and you put it in there. Now, you're not automatically, if the landlord says to you, you can leave. I saw another question like this in the chat. Let's say the landlord says, yeah, go ahead. I know you're supposed to be there through June, but if you vacate in April, I'll post the apartment April 11th, as long as you're out by the 10th. And you say, okay, and you leave. Just know that the landlord finding a suitable tenant is the precursor to you being relieved of your obligation. So they have to put a good faith effort into finding someone, but they may not find someone right now. People might not have money for moving costs. They may have to lower their standards for who they take. And now the landlord, turns 3 people away because they don't have as good income or credit scores. And then you go into the court and the judge is going to say, look, it's his apartment, her apartment, and they can rent it to whom they please. And if they're not financially stable, they don't have to rent it to get you off the hook. So I would be very careful, like before, get it in writing if possible, that you've been allowed to leave, but just know that you're kind of in the landlord's hands, and you're going to be, it's out of your hands, essentially, as to when your obligation is released.
I felt I was medically compromised at an apartment where I was living, and I wrote a notice to quit, and I gave 45 days notice of my intent to leave. One of the other signatories to the lease wants to stay in the apartment and continue renting for the remainder of the lease. The landlord wants to charge me with abandonment and pursue me to pay the remaining 8 months of the lease at the higher rate in the lease and not work with the other tenant, which would require reducing the rent. I know that laws are prohibiting evictions right now, but does that also apply to not forcing someone to stay in an apartment if they are concerned about their health?
Yeah, we touched on this a bit earlier about, having roommates and being compromised. Off the top, nice work, sending the 40-day notice to quit, getting everything in writing, good job there. You covered your, rear end as far as initiating it goes. As far as the increase, whether it's timely, it's going to be jurisdictional. It's going to be based on what city or state you're in as to whether they allow them to do that. But again, the temperature of the courts is going to be such that if you were living in, one apartment with, or an apartment with one other person, you may not be as entitled to get out of that apartment without it being considered abandonment as if you had 3 roommates or 4 or something. So it's a sliding scale. Just be aware you may owe something. The landlord doesn't have to take that notice to quit. They could think I have a lease and they're going to owe me for the end of the term. And like we talked about before, that's going to come down to whether a court decides that this is a force majeure act of God that none of the parties could have considered. So it's uncertain. Just feel good that you did the right thing from here on out, and you're going to have to wait and see, unfortunately. But I sympathize with you there.